Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the National Podcast, normally recorded in our studio at the Bishopbriggs Media Centre, currently recorded from our volunteers' homes. To keep in touch with us, use our social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram and Twitter, which are all at Q and Review. That's CUEANDREVIEW. Or get in touch via information@qandreview.com. That's information@CUEANDREVIEW.com. Please like and share our podcasts and give us any constructive feedback.
You're listening to The National as published on Friday the 13th of May 2022. Comment. Keir Starmer. Are Tories pressuring police to use Beergate against their rivals? By Joanna Cherry, columnist. It is hard to identify the low light of the debate on the Queen's speech in Parliament this week. From the sycophantic speeches by Tory backbenchers proposing and seconding the speech to the nauseating hypocrisy of Tory glee at Keir Starmer's discomfort over Beergate, it was difficult to sit through. But we hit a nadir when we had to listen to a short lecture from a Redwall Tory on why people need food banks. Apparently, it's because they don't know how to cook or budget. Lee Anderson MP, as it turns out, is a former Labour staffer. You'd think as an MP and an MP employee in recent years he might, from his casework, be aware of the benefits and in-work poverty that leads many of our constituents to rely on food banks to make ends meet. But no. I was lucky enough to be the next speaker and so was able to decline his offer to visit the food bank in his constituency and point out that all MPs have food banks in their constituencies and that the reason for their existence is the poverty caused by his government's policies. Poverty across the UK is set to rise thanks to the cost of living crisis, and yet the Tories' programme for government in this session abjectly fails to make meaningful proposals for addressing a crisis that is already hammering many people. There is nothing about cutting VAT on fuel bills, nothing about taxing big companies, not only energy companies, on excess profits, nothing to increase benefits, and nothing to reinstate the £20 that was cut from universal credit. Instead, we heard that a cabinet working group met on Tuesday to chuck around ideas to deal with the crisis but came to no conclusions. The lack of urgency and focus is as insulting as it is callous. Nor does the Queen's speech contain any measures to compensate people for the serial incompetence of the Home Office in respect of the handling of immigration and asylum cases and the issuing of passports, nor the serial incompetence of the Department of Transport over the issuing of driving licences. Everyone will know someone at present who is desperately waiting for their renewed passport to arrive. My inbox is full of emails from frantic constituents, many of whom have worked hard for holidays they will now miss out on, and even worse, some who are desperate to attend the funeral of a loved one abroad. The guiding principle of the Queen's speech should have been to tackle these sort of bread and butter issues. Instead, it was to diminish the accountability of the government to Parliament, the courts and voters. We see this in the plans to replace the Human Rights Act, HRA, with a watered-down Bill of Rights. We see it in the further plans to quash public protests in the Public Order Bill. And we see it in the so-called Brexit Freedoms Bill, which will expand the government minister's power to amend, appeal or replace EU retained law by way of secondary legislation. More Henry VIII powers. The cornerstone of all of this is limiting human rights protections, because so long as the HRA remains on the statute book and people can go to court to defend their rights, it remains a serious threat to the rest of the government's project to diminish its accountability by quashing protest and limiting access to justice. The Queen's speech contained a passage assuring us that her government will ensure the Constitution is upheld. It was hard not to laugh out loud as this phrase was read out by the Duke of Rothesay. The Prime Minister can't even uphold the ordinary laws of the land, and in 2019 he rode roughshod over the Constitution and lied to the Queen when he unlawfully prorogued Parliament. Then in 2020 his government introduced legislation designed to go back on their agreement with the EU and to break international law in a limited and specific way. Now the Tories are at it again with the Northern Ireland Protocol. Meanwhile, the Tories' cynical attempt to equate Labour's Tier 2 beer and curry by-election campaign refreshment stop with their serial law-breaking is not just cynical, it is also sinister. The police had already looked at this event and closed their investigation. The investigation now seems to have been reopened because of political pressure. I don't want to live in a state where the government, with the assistance of its little helpers in the right-wing press, is able to influence the police to reopen a closed investigation into their political enemies. It stinks. Most people can see the difference between what seems to be a working meal and the endless parade of parties with suitcases of booze and karaoke that took place at Number 10 during lockdown. People aren't stupid, but the idea that the government of the day should lean on the police or the prosecution services to dispose of their political rivals is very worrying. At least in Scotland we have a way out of all this. The local elections were an important reminder that this UK government has no mandate in Scotland and no mandate for any of the policies it is seeking to impose on us in its programme for government. It is no surprise that the Tories lost so many votes and have been reduced to third place in Scotland. On the doorsteps in Edinburgh South West, I heard over and over again the contempt in which the UK government is held. It's not just the endemic law-breaking, but it's the rank lack of respect for the frequently expressed view of the Scottish electorate for a different way of doing things and for the second independence referendum, given the broken promises of the first. I'm particularly proud that in the Pentland Hills ward of my constituency, my colleague and friend Fiona Glasgow displaced a Tory councillor to win yet another seat for the SNP on the City of Edinburgh Council. It's great to see the SNP so strong in our capital city, and it's always good to see women of independent mind elected to public office. However, everyone knows that winning elections is not an end in itself. It's what you do with the mandate you win that counts. Across Scotland, SNP councillors now have an important job to do, delivering on the promise to do everything they can to tackle the cost of living crisis. Meanwhile, at Holyrood, the time is fast approaching for announcement of the detail of the plan to deliver the promised second independence referendum and the arguments that will win it. This article was by Joanna Cherry. You're listening to The National as published on Friday the 13th of May 2022. Comment. Queen's speech offered nothing for the environment or the poor, by Lorna Slater. Last week's local elections were a breakthrough for the Scottish Greens and an important step in securing the better future and climate action that we need. In the weeks leading up to the election, we asked the people of Scotland to think globally and act locally. That message reached a record number of people, and we saw Green councillors elected in record numbers in areas where we have never won before. We broke new ground with the people of Shetland, Moray, the Borders, North Lanarkshire, Clackmannanshire, East Lothian, South Lanarkshire and Argyll and Bute, all electing their first ever Green councillors. These results will make a big difference. They will change the conversation in those town halls and put climate action and support for local services firmly on the agenda. In the areas where we already had councillors, including Edinburgh, where I live, Glasgow and the Highlands, people could see the positive impact that Green councillors are already bringing to their communities. They voted for more of that change, giving us more councillors in all three regions. Every vote for the Scottish Greens was a vote for a community champion and a vote to support our local services and invest in public transport and our environment. They were votes for less pollution, cleaner air, and to ensure that the well-being of people and the planet will always be right at the heart of everything we are doing. Foremost, the result was a reflection on the excellent work and commitment of our local candidates and campaigners. They have put a huge amount of time into building our support from the ground up. They have knocked on thousands of doors and spoken to thousands of residents. It's also a reflection on the work that Greens are doing in Holyrood and a vote of confidence in the progress we have made. With Greens in government, we are turning words into actions and promises into reality. We have shown what can be achieved when there are Green voices around the table and working positively and constructively for change. We have secured free bus travel for everyone under 22, as well as record investment in wildlife, nature, recycling and infrastructure for walking, wheeling and cycling. We are delivering the biggest investment in new teachers for a generation and new and better rights for tenants, including rent controls. A lot of the most important policies that we are introducing as part of the Scottish Government will be implemented in coordination with our local authorities. Last week's result means that all over Scotland, Green councillors will be working with Green MSPs to deliver on Green priorities. The next 5 years will be vital for our environment. The United Nations has described the climate crisis as code red for humanity and warned that it is now or never for the climate action that this generation of politicians must take. The climate crisis is global and needs global solutions, but many of the steps that we are taking will also rely on local action from our councils. That is what our teams will be working to deliver. They will be pushing for local commitments to net zero carbon emissions with robust action plans and milestones in place, which is exactly what has been achieved already by Green councillors in Edinburgh. They also aim to secure greater recycling services, better public transport, and a reduction in the use of single-use plastics. Watching the Queen's speech this week made it clear how urgent the situation is. People are suffering in a terrible cost of living crisis that has been exacerbated by the decisions of Boris Johnson and his colleagues. It was sickening and obscene to see it all being read out on top of a throne and in front of golden wallpaper. The optics were bad, but the content was worse. Beneath the pageantry and ceremony, there was very little substance. The speech offered more of the same. There was nothing positive or inspiring. There was nothing at all to help the millions of people who are being hit by skyrocketing energy prices and the biggest fall in living standards since records began. There was also nothing for the environment, with a big climate-shaped hole right in the middle. What it offered was a weak and unambitious energy policy, repressive new curbs and restrictions on the right to protest, a very selective so-called ban on conversion therapy, and an even more brutal and hostile environment for refugees. It wasn't just a missed opportunity, it was a conscious endorsement of a harsh, failing and unsustainable status quo at a time when bold and transformative action is needed. One Tory MP claimed the problem was that people who use food banks can't cook or budget properly. It was a condescending comment that said more about him than it did about people who have been forced to use a food bank. The simple fact is that no one can cook without ingredients or heat. It doesn't have to be like this. Our future can be brilliant. It can be so much better than what Downing Street is offering. We can follow a different path and build an independent Scotland that moves on from a disastrous Tory Brexit that we rejected, takes the climate action that is needed, and introduces economic policies that reduce inequality, help our communities, and create a fairer, greener society. Last week's election was another important step on that journey. I know that we were only able to get the result that we did because thousands of people took the plunge and voted Green for the first time. I know that it can be a big step to change your vote and sometimes the habit of a lifetime. We can't thank you enough for your trust and support. We will not let you down. We will never take any vote for granted, and over the next 5 years our team will do everything that we can to live up to your expectations and deliver the change that you voted for. This article was by Lorna Slater.
This article is from The National, date 13th May 2022, from the News section. Kids OR, Scots charity in Kenyan refugee camp, operating room world first. By Lucinda Cameron. A Scottish charity has opened a children's operating room in a refugee camp in Kenya in what is thought to be a world first. The facility in Kakuma, Kenya, was set up by the charity Kids Operating Room, or Kids OR, which delivered and installed more than 3,000 items of equipment and surgical tools to provide safe surgery at the site. It has been in use for nearly a year and is expected to have capacity for operations on up to 1,000 children annually, providing life-saving treatments that were previously unavailable in Kakuma due to the lack of necessary surgical equipment and paediatric surgeons. Kids OR said the camp, which has a larger population than Dundee, is home to around 40,000 children. Dr. Nima Kazee, a paediatric surgeon and Kids OR advisory member, has been training a surgical team in Kenya to maximise use of the operating room while leading the procedures that have taken place so far. She said, "It's hard for most of us to imagine living in a refugee camp setting let alone the thought of our child not being able to access the surgery that could save their life or alleviate them from terrible pain. I'm honoured to be able to play a part in these life-changing operations and the social and economic benefits the installation has brought to the area. Jibril Hussein Imidi, 10, was one of the first patients to receive surgery from the doctor and her surgical team, having suffered from debilitating and a painful hernia since birth. His condition had previously been left untreated due to the lack of specialist surgeons and facilities that were adapted to children, causing him severe stomach pain and digestion issues. Finally, his 40-minute surgery took place. His mother Aziza said, "We had so many challenges before he was operated on. We could not go a week without him falling sick. The hospital became our home. We spent less and less time at home and more time at the hospital." The operating room provided Jibril with the operation that he so desperately needed. The surgery has helped so much. He's now back at school and doing so well. Kids OR representatives joined surgical teams, key figures from the UN Refugee Agency and the International Rescue Committee at Kakuma General Hospital in the camp on Friday, along with county officials of Kenya for a ceremony to cut the ribbon and officially open the operating room. Edinburgh-headquartered Kids OR was founded by husband and wife philanthropists Gareth and Nicola Wood. Mr. Wood said, "The new safe surgical facilities, equipment and trained medical staff in Kakuma have already had a substantial effect. Thousands of children can now access timely surgical care in Kakuma refugee camp, which has a bigger population than Dundee, and this is something that should be celebrated." It was rewarding for many of those involved in this milestone project to officially mark the occasion, especially after the long delays and understandable postponements of the event over the last year. This is only the start, and we will strive to continue progressing this vital requirement, not only throughout Africa but other developing countries. Kakuma was originally founded in 1992 for people fleeing war in Sudan and has a population of around 185,000 people, according to UN data. That article was by Lucinda Cameron. This article is from The National, date 16th May 2022, from the Culture section. How famous Scot Andrew Carnegie became the richest man in the world, by Michael Fry. By the end of the 19th century, the richest man in the world was a Scot, Andrew Carnegie, whose huge business empire rested on the Carnegie Steel Company of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He had been born at Dunfermline in 1835 and emigrated with his parents to the US in 1848. For everything else in his career, he had depended on himself, and this was the advice about getting on in life that he regularly gave to others. The landscape of western Pennsylvania mixed heavy industry with forested hills and tumbling waters, so it bore some resemblance to Scotland. Carnegie liked these backwoods so much that, with a circle of about 50 friends and colleagues, he clubbed together to buy a large land holding they could use for private hunting and fishing. It had a reservoir and dam, cottages and a clubhouse. These were careful capitalists who never spent more than they needed to on their pleasures. This time it turned out not to be enough. The winter of 1880 to 81 brought a deep freak freeze with masses of snow drifting over this stretch of the Allegheny Mountains late on into the year. It was still lying there on the weekend of May 31st, which saw further heavy rain sweep in from the west. The dam, 72 feet high and 930 foot long, did not remain intact beyond an afternoon of this hellish tempest. It collapsed and sent 15 million tonnes of water hurtling down the gorges to the woods, the same as the normal flow rate of the Mississippi River. It took 65 minutes for the reservoir to run dry. Hamlets and farms were swept away without a trace. At the foot of the valley stood the industrial settlement of Johnstown. Here, more than 2,000 people died. It was the largest ever loss of civilian life in the history of the US up to that time. Carnegie and his colleagues formed a relief committee to help the survivors. They also entered into an agreement among themselves never to speak publicly about the club or the flood. This was all private property and no concern of anybody else. But Carnegie did build Johnson a new public library as thankful consolation. The gift achieved for him what he wanted by fending off all the uncomfortable inquiries. The club was never held legally responsible for the disaster. A precedent was set that later saved capitalists a lot of money. Victims, it seemed, could look after themselves, if still alive. The fishers and hunters were working according to the principle of strict liability, which on a far grander scale was a godsend in a huge nation of headlong development. It was bound to be expensive in human lives as well as in material resources, and one way to cover both kinds of cost was simply to maximise the rate of progress. This was a principle Carnegie seemed to believe in, as he had shown while his personal career was taking shape. He had first started work as a telegrapher and, by the 1860s, owned investments in railways, sleeping cars, bridges and oil derricks. He built further wealth as a bond salesman, raising money for American enterprise in Europe. With his Carnegie Steel Company, he in effect refounded the city of Pittsburgh, a historic imperial outpost. He sold the plant on to J.P. Morgan for $303 million in 1901, when it formed the basis of the US Steel Corporation. Carnegie now surpassed John D. Rockefeller as the richest American of all. Carnegie had not, by his own lights, been doing anything immoral, yet his code of business ethics were different from what prevailed in later times. For instance, the Homestead Strike was a bloody confrontation lasting 143 days in 1892, centred on Carnegie's Steel's main plant in Pennsylvania, where it was in frequent conflict with local trade unions. When the unions and the company failed to agree on new wage rates, the management locked the men out. From the workers' point of view, a lockout that was enforced from one side could not amount to a strike by the other. The management was in the wrong and the workers were in the right to stick up for themselves, while the duty of the state government was to support them. Unfortunately for the workers, the state government did not take the same view. It went to law against the union and brought in thousands of strikebreakers to operate the steel mills. This was a victory for Carnegie. His company successfully resumed operations by offering the jobs to the homestead workforce to immigrant employees who had no union. The governor of Pennsylvania cooperated and ordered out 2 brigades of the state militia to keep the strikers under control. Carnegie helped to make sure the US was never going to turn into an economy dominated by its organised workforce. At best, there might be a social consensus achieved by bosses like him. Anything short of that would be a victory for militant pressure and therefore unacceptable. In the course of time, the whole of US industry came close to standing on Carnegie's principles. But he also set out to show there was more to this than capitalist dictatorship. According to him, the social duties of a wealthy industrialist should comprise 2 parts. The first was the gathering and accumulation of wealth. The second was for its subsequent distribution to benevolent causes. Philanthropy was the key to making the capitalist system good for all. This train of thought was what inspired Carnegie in his last years. After his official retiral from his own companies in 1900, he talked less about the sharp business acumen that had enabled him to make the biggest fortune in the US. Instead, he stressed the public spirit he now wanted to show in pursuing philanthropic projects. He became the Western world's greatest advocate for turning enterprise to pay for social schemes hard to realise in any other way. This was the path to public good, social advancement and educational progress. It was lucky for Scotland that Carnegie had been born here and late in life spent as much time as he could at his own Skibo Castle in Sutherland and endowed some of his greatest projects to his native soil. He gave $10 million to establish the Carnegie Trust for the Universities of Scotland, which every year provides them with a lavish addition to their income. The aim is to improve the opportunities and extend the scope for scientific research by deserving and qualified young people. An even wider philanthropic initiative has been to establish public libraries all over the UK, the US, Canada and other English-speaking countries. Not all the effort has been on a gigantic scale though. The Carnegie Dunfermline Trust has focused on the town where the multimillionaire was born. In addition to a library, it acquired the private estate that became Pittencrieff Park and opened it all to the townsfolk. After a century, we can say it still has some way to go before converting them to capitalism. That article was by Michael Fry. This article is from The National, date 16th May 2022. From the Politics section. Rachel McLean, Tory Minister, insults workers in Sky News interview. By Angus Cochrane. A Tory minister has told people who are struggling desperately to make ends meet during the cost of living crisis that they should work extra hours or move to a better paid job. The comment has sparked fury and fuelled further accusations that Boris Johnson's administration is totally detached from the struggles ordinary people are facing as the result of the pandemic and Brexit, as well as soaring inflation, energy prices and food bills. Safeguarding Minister Rachel McLean, speaking to Sky News, sought to reassure low-paid workers that there was a way to protect themselves. She insisted there is more help coming from the UK government to relieve short-term pressures, despite Tory minister repeatedly ruling out an emergency budget to tackle the poverty crisis. She added, "Over the long term, we need to have a plan to grow the economy and make sure that people are able to protect themselves better, whether that is by taking on more hours or moving to a better paid job. And these are long-term actions, but that's what we're focused on as a government." Challenged on that point by host Kate K. Burley, who pointed out that many people who work multiple jobs still rely on food banks, McLean doubled down. She replied, "We have often heard in the past when people are facing problems with their budgets that one of the obstacles, and it may not be for everybody, is about being able to take on more hours or even move to a better paid job. Of course, it's an individual situation, depending on that particular family's situation. But that's why the job centres exist. That's why the job coaches exist. That's why we've put the support into those job centres to work with individuals on their own individual situation. So it may be right for some people, they may be able to access additional hours. But of course, it's not going to work for people who are already working in 3 jobs. Scotland's Education Secretary, Shirley Ann Somerville, was among scores of politicians to condemn the remarks. She referenced comments last week from Tory MP Lee Anderson, who blamed poor cooking and budgeting skills for food bank use. Last week, folk were too stupid to cook properly, Somerville commented. This week, folk are too lazy to work enough hours. Can't believe the UK government's response to cost of living crisis is to blame the people being hit the hardest. Scottish Labour MP and Shadow Scotland Office Minister Ian Murray characterised the remarks as tone deaf and said they harked back to Margaret Thatcher-era politics. He replied, "Sounds like the Norman Tebbit get on your bike instructions from the 1980s. It is so out of touch with reality that I'm sure the Minister knows how ludicrous it is, but they'll defend Boris Johnson at all costs." SNP MP Martin Doherty Hughes said Maclean was making the case for Scottish independence. "Plenty of the people now struggling hardest with the cost of living crisis are key workers," he tweeted. "Mind how they worked throughout the pandemic. Yet here we are, the Conservatives doing what they do best. Scotland, you are watching." Labour MP Tulip Siddiq added, "This is just so insulting to so many of my constituents who are working every hour possible and struggling to make ends meet. No wonder people think politicians are out of touch." Speaking later to LBC, Maclean said nothing is off the table when it came to extending support to the public through the current crisis. She was told that even after £22 billion worth of support from central government had been accounted for, food banks were facing increased demand and child poverty was predicted to rise by the winter. "You will know that the Chancellor always keeps everything under review in terms of fiscal response," she replied. "What we want to do is make sure we are protecting families and help them to weather the storm. And you've seen that response coming into place. You've seen it all the way through the COVID pandemic. Nothing is off the table, and we will make sure we do everything we can to protect families." The Prime Minister has signalled in recent days that he could cave in to opposition demands for a windfall tax on energy giants. It's reported Chancellor Rishi Sunak has told Treasury officials to examine plans for a levy on the soaring profits of oil and gas firms. That article was by Angus Cochran.
From The National, Monday the 16th of May 2022, from the comment section, Kirsty Strickland, "Boris Johnson shouldn't judge other workers by his own low standards." Whenever Boris Johnson begins an analysis of an issue by referencing what his own personal experience of it is, you know the argument that follows will be virtually meaningless. Saturday's words of wisdom were on the new frontier of the culture war, so eagerly pursued by some right-wing politicians and commentators. Working from home has replaced eating avocados and believing in social justice as the new signifier of progressive idiocy. According to the Prime Minister, employees now can't be trusted to work from home, as they did so ably during the pandemic. His argument for this is very telling in itself. Hidden from the watchful eyes of bosses, Boris Johnson thinks it's only natural folk will slack off a bit. They'll cut corners with their work and their productivity will drop. My experience of working from home is that you spend an awful lot of time making another cup of coffee and then, getting up, walking very slowly to the fridge, hacking off a small piece of cheese, then walking very slowly back to your laptop and then forgetting what it was you're doing, he said. Read that quote again and then remember that this is the man in charge of our nuclear weapons. It should go without saying that Johnson's experience of working from home is unlike that of the average person. His is a workplace full of people who apparently couldn't function during a global pandemic and national lockdown without a constant stream of alcohol-based incentives for doing the job they were paid to do. It shows a stunning lack of self-awareness on the part of the Prime Minister to complain others might be inclined to take liberties with the rules. The workplace that he heads, one that also happens to be his home, was party central at a time when he was illegal to visit your dying relatives. Last week, the Met Police announced that a further 50 fines had been issued over Partygate. That brings the total number to more than 100 and makes Downing Street the most law-breaking workplace in the country when it comes to COVID restrictions. As a freelance columnist, I worked from home before the pandemic as well as during it, so I'm probably not the most representative case study either. But my friends and family who made the transition from office to home working are. Throughout this tiresome debate about working from home, bad faith actors only want to talk in extremes and absolutes. In reality, there's more neutral ground we could discuss these issues on. Working from home isn't for everyone. Some of my younger friends were eager to get out of their pokey flat shares and back into the office. Others, parents in particular, have benefited enormously from the flexibility that the hybrid model of working offers. It's no surprise that Jacob Rees-Mogg, a man who has fathered enough children to set up a full orchestra but is famously hands-off when it comes to actually caring for them, is one of the government's most prominent critics of working from home. When he's not creeping down Whitehall corridors and leaving passive-aggressive notes for civil servants, Mr Rees-Mogg is waging war against the public sector and defending government plans to axe 90,000 jobs. The concept of personal responsibility might be alien to many of the old Etonians we have running the country, but employees are perfectly able to exercise it. One of the only positive legacies from the pandemic is that it forced companies to be more flexible. They had to find new, creative ways of working, while staff couldn't physically be in many workplaces. It wasn't without its challenges, but the rewards are clear to see. Those who yearn to be back among colleagues and find that they work better in an office environment should have the opportunity to do so. But let's not pretend that this is gold standard working model that's right for everybody. The Tory government talks about work-life balance as though it's some fluffy leafy concept that will lead to chaos. In reality, it's the same privilege many of them enjoy. They just don't want to see it extended to others. Spending hundreds of hours and thousands of pounds a year to commute to an office isn't a vital ingredient for workforce productivity. Boris Johnson shouldn't judge other workers by his own shoddy standards. The Prime Minister might have the attention span of an overtired toddler, but ordinary workers do not. Instead of engaging in a phony and needless battle to make workplaces function as they did pre-pandemic, Johnson and his ilk should concentrate on their own jobs. The public won't take lectures on personal responsibility from a group of people who showed such reckless disregard for their own work obligations during a time of national crisis. And that was an opinion piece by Kirsty Strickland. From the National, Tuesday the 17th of May 2022, from the news section, BBC reports nothing about Nicola Sturgeon's meeting with top US politicians, by Xander Richards. The BBC has been asked to explain why it has failed to cover the First Minister's US visit on its website. Previous visits to America undertaken by Nicola Sturgeon have been covered online by the corporation, including in 2015, 2017 and 2019. However, the current trip, which has seen the SNP leader praised by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi as a real model to women everywhere, has been largely ignored. There is no mention of Sturgeon's meeting with Pelosi or her discussions on the constitutional future of the UK with Deputy Secretary of State for the State Department Wendy Sherman. It also has not covered Sturgeon's comments on an independent Scotland and NATO membership. The above stories have been variously reported across the front pages of newspapers, including The National, The Herald, The Telegraph and The Express. The NATO commitment was also reported by international news agency Bloomberg. SNP staffer Fraser McDonald commented, "Bloomberg, with 8.2 million followers on Twitter, covers the First Minister's visit to the US. It hasn't yet made the BBC website." The only BBC report which touches on the First Minister's US visit focuses largely on the Tory COP26 president, Alok Sharma. Under a headline reporting Sharma's comments about the world leaders' failure to act against the climate crisis, the BBC said that Sturgeon had also issued a warning over climate change during a trip to the US. Though the article only mentioned the First Minister once more, a longer quote from her on climate change and a link to the Ukraine war were included in analysis from the BBC climate editor Justin Rowlett further down the page. Commenting on the lack of coverage, SNP MP Peter Grant quipped, "Due to cutbacks at BBC Scotland News, they obviously haven't heard about this." he had shared a post from Pelosi saying it had been official honour to welcome the First Minister of Scotland. Grant is part of a slew of Twitter users who have questioned why the BBC has failed to cover the meetings between Sturgeon and Pelosi and Sturgeon and Sherman. Hey at BBC Scotland News, shouldn't you be headlining this news, showing how welcome Scotland's First Minister is globally? One user asked. At BBC Scotland News, nothing? Really? Another added. A BBC spokesperson said that they had covered Sturgeon's US visit as a lead story before editing it. They said, the First Minister's trip was the lead story on the BBC News website, Scotland, index page for much of the day. It led in the warnings from Ms Sturgeon on climate change following the COP26 conference in Glasgow. It was later that the story was updated following the comments in Scotland from Alok Sharma, which then became the lead line. The BBC did not address why it has failed to cover key meetings held between Sturgeon, Pelosi and Sherman. Stephen Gethins, the Professor of International Relations and former MP, told The National the US visit reflected a relationship that goes back right to the foundations of the United States. Gethins went on, this is a significant meeting for the First Minister and underlines the importance of the relationship between the USA and Scotland. That is reflected in Scotland's diaspora that has deep roots in every one of the US's 50 states and played a prominent role in the country's development. It is clear from this meeting that this will continue to be an important partnership into the future as cooperation deepens in trade, climate change, research and culture, among other areas. That is good for jobs and investment, as Scotland's foreign policy footprint continues to grow. It comes after the BBC refused to explain why it had failed to cover the National Crime Agency's raid of Tory peer Michael Moan's home as part of a probe into alleged PPE fraud. In the latest development, Moan's husband has admitted to having a financial interest in the firm at the centre of the allegations. The BBC has still not reported on the incident. And that was a report by Xander Richards. From The National, Tuesday the 17th of May 2022, from the news section, Loch Torridon, kayaker dies after signalling emergency, by Xander Richards. A kayaker has died after getting into difficulty on a loch. The woman contacted the Coast Guard to ask for help at around 11:07am on Tuesday. She was airlifted to hospital after she was found on Loch Torridon in the Highlands at around 12:30pm and taken on board Portree lifeboat, but she died at the scene. Her next of kin have been informed and the report has been sent to the Procurator Fiscal. A spokesperson for Police Scotland said, around 12:05pm on Tuesday, May the 17th, 2022, police received a report of concern for a kayaker on Loch Torridon near Shieldaig. Officers assisted Coast Guard in tracing the woman, who was recovered but later died at the scene. Her next of kin had been made aware and the report will be submitted to the Procurator Fiscal. And that article was by Xander Richards. From The National, Tuesday the 17th of May 2022, from the politics section, SNP and Greens strike Glasgow deal to run City Council, by Hamish Morrison. The SNP and the Greens have announced a deal to run Scotland's largest local authority. The Greens have agreed to back an SNP minority administration while being guaranteed some key roles by the larger party. Green councillors have been told they will chair a new Net Zero and Climate Progress Monitoring Committee and a Just Transition Working Group. They will also chair the city's Neighbourhoods and Housing Committee and hold vice chair positions on the Education and Environment Committees. The Greens say the deal means they will officially remain in opposition while providing support for the SNP minority administration. Both parties worked collaboratively in the previous administration, also an SNP minority, including passing joint budgets. The SNP said the agreement is only binding in the first vote of the new council, which will be held on Thursday, May the 19th, and will see the election of a leader and Lord Provost. It is expected the leader will continue to be Susan Aitken. While the SNP, led by Aitken, lost 2 seats, the Greens, jointly led by John Molyneux and Martha Wardrop, picked up 3 and pipped the SNP leader to the top spot in her Langside ward. Aitken said, Glaswegians face huge challenges in the years ahead, from the daily impact of the cost of living crisis on incomes and the longer-term effect of the pandemic and Brexit on communities, through ensuring a fair and just transition delivers for all Glaswegians and that our city is climate ready. In a time of great uncertainty, this agreement between the SNP and Greens can help provide the confident and responsible leadership this city and its people require. This is about doing politics and governance differently. It's clear that the SNP and Greens have much common ground and have agreed in recent years on how best to meet major challenges affecting Glaswegians, and, crucially, we will share a willingness to collaborate to take the bold, urgent and progressive action which the immediate and future needs of Glaswegians demands. Greens co-leader Wardrop said, "The recent election result clearly showed us that the people of Glasgow agreed with our vision for a more effective, more democratic and forward-looking council. With our largest ever group of Green councillors, we will hold a minority SNP administration to account while working collaboratively across party lines to deliver a fairer, greener and more inclusive Glasgow and to bring about the change that people voted for." Molyneux said the incoming administration would ensure the council listens to those we represent and delivers for our communities. He added the next priority for the administration would be agreeing a 5-year plan for the city to deliver the progressive change people want to see. The SNP said the 5-year strategic plan would include compatible manifesto commitments from both parties and additional commitments from each group. The Greens currently hold 10 seats on the council, overtaking the Tories as the third largest group following the vote on May the 5th. And that piece was by Hamish Morrison.
From The National of Thursday the 19th of May 2022, from the comment section, "A hard Brexit is clearly in conflict with achieving peace in Northern Ireland," by Alan Smith. At times it feels like it's Groundhog Day in Westminster. Yesterday's statement in the House of Commons on the Northern Ireland Protocol was another of those occasions. Once again, a UK government minister claims that the protocol isn't working. Once again, the UK is threatening to trigger Article 16 as a silver bullet to solve the problem it created. Spoiler alert, it won't. And once again it was evident that Tory ministers have as much clue about what is happening in Northern Ireland as they do in Scotland. It beggars belief that the Tories claim that the war in Ukraine is no time to change a Prime Minister, but that now is the time to play with fire in Northern Ireland. At precisely the moment when Europe is united in the face of Putin's invasion, only Brexiteers could lack the self-awareness to start a fight with our closest friends and allies. None of this should come as any surprise. Brexit was always a project which would end up making poorer the people of these islands, unhealthier and more insecure. Readers of this paper will be well aware of the close ties that exist between Scotland and the island of Ireland. This is especially so in Northern Ireland, where the people there, alongside the people of Scotland, voted to reject Brexit. Unlike in Scotland, Northern Ireland was, rightly, given special treatment to preserve peace in Northern Ireland. The protocol is the result of this process, and I, for one, am all for anything which helps preserve peace. The Troubles are not ancient history. They were a heavy weight on the lives of so many of us in these islands. The Good Friday Agreement, which finally brought peace, is not something to be ignored or belittled. This is something that Johnson's cabal of ministers seem to have forgotten. Having appointed himself as the deliverer of Brexit, no doubt he believes he can simply command decrees and it shall be done. If a peace agreement and the international law gets in the way, what does it matter to him? How ironic, then, that he should wax lyrically about liberal values and democracy when his own party so patently ignores it. It's not even been a month when most of the members of the Legislative Assembly in Northern Ireland were elected on a platform endorsing the protocol. Even most businesses in Northern Ireland, whilst not particularly happy with the extra paperwork, are reaping the benefits of having access to the single market. Exports from Northern Ireland to the Republic were up 34% this quarter compared to the same time in 2021. The National Institute of Economic and Social Research has found that Northern Ireland's economy, quotes, has slightly outperformed the UK average since closer links with the EU through trade and also potentially labour mobility have benefited Northern Ireland post-Brexit. End of quotation. It seems as if the DUP, caught up in the mythos of unionism, is trying to square the circle of a hard Brexit with preserving peace in Northern Ireland. It simply cannot be done. And so we came to yesterday's statement. I sat in the chamber as the Foreign Secretary announced her intention to bring forward legislation to unilaterally rip up the protocol unless Brussels compromises on its position. All her grandstanding conveniently forgot that this was a deal her own government signed up to and sold by the Prime Minister as an oven-ready deal. The curse of forgetfulness is clearly a symptom of working in Johnson's cabinet, since Minister for Brexit Opportunities Jacob Rees-Mogg has also claimed that fully implementing the protocol would be an act of self-harm. The protocol has seen Northern Irish businesses benefit from the EU single market, much like an independent Scotland will also see rewards from its membership of the European Union. We have a strong interest in what happens in Northern Ireland, not just because of geographical proximity, but because of shared ties of culture, language and history. As I was once told, only half jokingly, Belfast and Glasgow are one city separated by a large river. The SNP remain committed to protecting the precious peace on the island of Ireland. While this can only be done by respecting the letter and principle of the Good Friday Agreement, these Tory ministers have shown again and again that international law and agreements negotiated in good faith mean nothing to them. Again and again the Tories choose blind ideology over the peace and prosperity of the people of these islands and choose their party over their country. We all deserve better. This article was by Alan Smith.
From The National, Thursday the 19th of May 2022, from the sports section. Rangers suffer shootout heartbreak in Seville in excruciating end to Europa League campaign. By Matthew Lindsay. This excruciating penalty shootout defeat wasn't how Rangers' exhilarating Europa League campaign deserved to end. Fans of the Ibrox club had jumped on planes, trains and automobiles and flocked to Seville in their tens of thousands this week, expecting, not just hoping, to see their heroes triumph and lift the trophy. Wins over Borussia Dortmund, Red Star Belgrade, Braga and RB Leipzig in the knockout rounds this year had built up a seemingly unstoppable momentum and fuelled a feel-good factor in the stands. But the light blue army who crammed into the Ramon Sanchez Pizjuan stadium tonight were to be left devastated after 120 nerve-wracking minutes of football and 10 spot kicks. Their German opponents, who finished some distance behind Dortmund and Leipzig in the Bundesliga this term, had knocked out Real Betis, Barcelona and West Ham themselves and proved to be formidable adversaries. They fought back well after Joe Aribo had given Rangers a second-half lead and equalised through their own free-scoring forward Raphael Borré. It went to extra time and then penalties, and when Kevin Trapp saved from Aaron Ramsey, the Juventus loanee who had come on late, it opened the door for Eintracht. Filip Kostic and then Borra made no mistake from 12 yards, and a 5-4 win was secured. Since Hibernian took part in the inaugural European Cup back in 1955, only 3 Scottish clubs have managed to lay their hands on silverware in continental competition. Celtic won the European Cup in Lisbon in 1967. Rangers lifted the European Cup Winners' Cup in Barcelona in 1972, and Aberdeen also triumphed in European Cup Winners' Cup in Gothenburg in 1983. So Giovanni von Bronckhorst's side were bidding to join some extremely illustrious company. Their gutsy display was typical of them. It was, however, not to be. Manchester United, Inter Milan, Arsenal, Marseille and Ajax have all been defeated in the final of this tournament in the past 5 years, so they are in good company. But that fact will be of no consolation to them after such a cruel climax. Van Bronckhorst named the same team that had started in both of the semi-final matches against Leipzig, despite Kermar Roof being available for the first time since limping off in the Scottish Cup semi-final last month. Roof is a far more experienced and dangerous forward than Scott Wright. The lack of game time the Jamaican international has had in recent weeks, though, meant the Dutchman stuck with the Scot. Sebastian Rode, the Eintracht captain and midfielder, suffered a head injury following a challenge by John Lundstram shortly after that, and play was stopped for several minutes while he had a bandage applied to a cut. Rode's teammates, Daichi Kamada and Gibril Sau, could both have opened the scoring when the action resumed. The former failed to shoot early enough after getting on the end of an Almani Tour delivery, and when the ball broke to the latter, he had his effort easily saved by Alan McGregor. Von Bronckhorst switched from a 4-2-3-1 formation when his team was out of possession to a 4-3-4 setup when they had the ball, but they were unable to either contain their opponents or get forward in numbers during the early exchanges. McGregor kept Rangers level after Angsar Knauf had cut inside Borna Barisic and Kevin Bassi and got an attempt away. Nobody picked up Lindstrom at the subsequent corner either. They were fortunate such sloppy play wasn't punished. Aribo, acting as the lone striker in the absence of both Alfredo Morelos and Ruth, curved just wide enough of the left post in the 24th minute, following good work by Wright. Barisic then picked out John Lundstram with a free kick, and the utility man forced Trapp to kick his header over. These 2 opportunities suggested that Rangers were gaining greater control of proceedings. They certainly ended the first half on a positive note when Ryan Jack went close after some patient build-up play. Still, they had lived very dangerously at times and had not produced the sort of sparkling attacking play that had done such damage against Dortmund, Red Star, Braga and Leipzig in the opening 45 minutes. Van Bronckhorst had much to sort out at half-time. Eintracht started the second half far more positively. Jesper Lindstrom had a shot deflected wide and then went to ground in the penalty box following a challenge by Connor Goldson. The match official allowed play to continue after a VAR check. Rangers, though, regrouped and took the lead in the 57th minute. Goldson headed a trap clearance into the Eintracht half, and Tuta tripped himself up and fell to the ground as he was attempting to get to the ball. Aribo burst forward, kept his composure despite Ndika closing in on him, and coolly slotted into the net. Cue utter bedlam inside the ground. The fans who had been concerned after the opportunities their team were conceding erupted. The strike was slightly fortuitous, but nobody was caring. Glasner removed Tuta immediately and put on the experienced Makoto Hasebe. The change made a difference. Kamada flicked just over the crossbar and then Borra levelled. Kostic squared into the 6-yard box. Goldson failed to clear and Borra edged in front of Bassi and diverted past McGregor. Bronckhorst responded by putting on Stephen Davis for Jack and Fashion Sakala for Wright. Jens Petter Hage came on for Lindstrom and slashed just wide. Sakala tested Trapp. The game went to extra time and Scott Arfield came on for Glenn Kamara. Bassi gifted Borra a gift in the first period when he gave the ball away, but he made amends for his error when he slid in and blocked the shot. James Sands then took over from Aribo. The tension in the ground as both sides probed for an opening was palpable, and the atmosphere nervous. Kent tried his luck from long range, only for Trapp to deny him. Ramsey went on for Sakala, and Roof took over from Barisic within 5 minutes left. Roof supplied Kent only for Trapp to block with his leg. Then Rangers were awarded a free kick within range in the final minute. He got his attempt on target, but the keeper held it. Trapp also denied Ramsey with his legs in the shootout to clinch victory. This article was by Matthew Lindsay.
The National. Politics on Wednesday the 18th of May. BBC criticised for lack of coverage of Nicola Sturgeon's US trip. A front-page article written by Xander Richards, political reporter. A former BBC head of news is among those to have condemned its website for a failure to cover the First Minister's United States visit. Previous visits to America undertaken by Nicola Sturgeon have been covered online by the corporation, including in 2015, 2017 and 2019. However, the current trip, which has seen the SNP leader praised by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi as a real model to women everywhere, has been largely ignored. There's been no mention of Ms Sturgeon's meeting with Ms Pelosi or her discussions on the constitutional future of the UK with Deputy Secretary of State for the State Department, Wendy Sherman. It did not cover Ms Sturgeon's comments on an independent Scotland, and a Glenn Campbell analysis piece on NATO membership only arrived last night after our reporting. The above stories have been variously reported across the front pages of newspapers. The NATO commitment was also reported by international news agency Bloomberg. SNP staffer Fraser MacDonald commented, "Bloomberg, with 8.2 million followers on Twitter, covers the First Minister's visit to the United States. It hasn't yet made the BBC website." The only BBC report which touched on the First Minister's visit focused largely on the Tory COP26 president, Alok Sharma. Under a headline reporting Mr Sharma's comments about world leaders' failure to act against the climate crisis, the BBC said that Ms Sturgeon had also issued a warning over climate change during a trip to the US. Though the article only mentioned the First Minister once more, a longer quote for her on climate change and a link to the Ukraine war were included in analysis from BBC climate editor Justin Rowlatt further down the page. Commenting on the lack of coverage, SNP MP Peter Grant quipped, "Due to cutbacks at BBC Scotland News, they obviously haven't heard about this." He'd shared a post from Ms Pelosi saying it had been an official honour to welcome the First Minister of Scotland. Others questioning the BBC's lack of coverage include Stuart Easton, former head of news and current affairs for BBC Radio Scotland. A tweet by journalist Neil Mackay said, "Editorially, it's impossible to understand the BBC's failure to adequately report Nicola Sturgeon's visit to America. As I'm not of a conspiratorial mindset, I will err on the side of this being a case of inadequate journalism and bad decision-making. Some may see it otherwise." Mr Easton quoted this tweet, adding, "It's noticeably and wrongly absent from BBC Scotland's news coverage. Bad decision." A BBC spokesperson said that they had covered Ms Sturgeon's US visit as a lead story before editing it. They said, "The First Minister's trip was the lead story on the BBC News website Scotland index page for much of the day. It led on the warnings from Ms Sturgeon on climate change following the COP26 conference in Glasgow. It was later that the story was updated following the comments in Scotland from Alok Sharma, which then became the lead line. It comes after the BBC refused to explain why it had failed to cover the National Crime Agency's raid of Tory peer Michelle Mone's home as part of a probe into alleged PPE fraud. An article written by Xander Richards. The National. Politics on Wednesday the 18th of May. Yes vote would give a bloody nose to England. An exclusive interview article written by Craig Meegan, multimedia journalist. Steve Coogan has said that part of him wants Scotland to vote for independence, just to give a bloody nose to English London establishment thinkers. Speaking to The National, the comedian discussed his evolving views on Scotland leaving the Union. Mr Coogan, who is currently touring the UK with his new stage show Stratagem with Alan Partridge Live, said the Brexit vote led him to consider moving to Scotland. He said while Britain was an insular place, Scotland remained an outward-looking country. While England voted 53.4% to leave the EU, An overwhelming 62% of Scotland voted to remain, the highest proportion of any UK nation. Mr Coogan, who describes himself as a keen European, said Brexit changed his view on backing yes, but he added that he was still on the fence over what the consequences for the whole of the UK would be if Scotland were to leave. The actor said, "I wish England was different. I did consider after Brexit, I'll move to Scotland, just because Scotland is more outward-looking and Britain has this insularity that's to do with the empire, to do with its lost glory that it's never quite gotten over. But my slight antipathy is that I'm more sympathetic to the Labour Party than the Conservative Party. I've made no secret of that. If Scotland was to break away, then my worry is that there would never be another Labour government in England ever again. And that bothers me, because in a way, if Scotland broke away, it would be bad for people who want to challenge the establishment in England." Mr Coogan said he worries that if Scotland left the UK, those in England who want the Conservatives out of government would have fewer friends and fewer voters. He continued, "It's almost like it would be great for Scotland, but for people like me and other people who want to challenge the status quo, it wouldn't be good because we'd have fewer friends. That's the best way of putting it." The English actor said he wished devolution had been implemented more effectively, but added that it was not just Scotland that's been neglected by Westminster. He said, "Now I'm from Manchester, and we're neglected in the same way that Scotland has been historically neglected. It's not just a Scottish thing, the centralisation of power. So I've got a great deal of sympathy for independence. Sometimes I feel like saying part of me would like Scotland to break away, just to give a bloody nose to those sort of English, London-centric establishment thinkers. But then I also feel like the people on my side of politics need to stick together, whatever side of the border. I mean, I'm half Irish. I'd like to see United Ireland, so I do have a lot of sympathy with Scotland wanting independence. I suppose I'm sort of on the fence about it, for different reasons, but certainly I'm much more sympathetic these days than I have been in the past." Mr Coogan was among the 200 notable figures to sign the Guardian's letter in 2014. The letter said Scotland and the rest of Britain had more in common than what divided them. And Mr Coogan still believes there are basic values that unite those across the four nations of the UK. "I'd say people who have my political sympathies lie on all sides of the border," he said. "And people who have my world view, my view of life, lie on both sides of the border. There are establishment figures who I don't like to think of myself as uber-conservative types on both sides of the border. There are basic values that unite people on both sides of the border, but I think that it seems that that's less true now that Britain has embraced Brexit." Mr Coogan was more hopeful for the future, though, saying that a majority of the UK didn't vote for Brexit due to those who'd stayed home out of apathy. He pointed to polls which showed if the vote was held today, Remain would win. The 56-year-old didn't appear to think Boris Johnson had helped the union at all, and suggested the Prime Minister should have stuck to light entertainment. An exclusive interview article written by Craig Megan. The National News on Wednesday the 18th of May. Scotland's unemployed rate falls to all-time low. An article written by Angus Cochrane, multimedia journalist. Scotland's unemployment rate has fallen to the lowest level on record, new figures show. Between January and March this year, just 3.2% of those aged 16 and older were unemployed, according to quarterly data from the Office for National Statistics. This is 0.9 percentage points down on the previous quarter and 0.5 percentage points below the equivalent UK figure for the first quarter, which was 3.7%. The employment rate for those aged 16 to 64 years rose to 75.6% north of the border, which was 1.4 percentage points up on the previous quarter. The figures were released as the Governor of the Bank of England warned that there's a very real income shock coming from energy prices and apocalyptic food prices. Employment Minister Richard Lochhead said, for January to March 2022, Scotland's estimated employment rate rose over the quarter to 75.6%, while the estimated unemployment rate fell to a record low of 3.2%. Separate HMRC early estimates showed 2.42 million payrolled employees in Scotland in April 2022, 29,000 more than in February 2020, prior to the pandemic. While we continue to face economic challenges with the rising cost of living, the negative effects of Brexit and the economic impacts of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, the Scottish Government remains committed to doing all we can to help our economy recover. He added, by delivering on the actions of the National Strategy for Economic Transformation, we will build an economy of secure, sustainable and satisfying jobs. In 2022-2023, up to £113 million has been allocated to employability services, including £60 million for No One Left Behind, and additional investment in the Parental Employability Support Fund and tackling child poverty. The Employment Minister added that the Scottish Government is also continuing to invest in employment opportunities and training courses to support young people through the Young Persons Guarantee commitment and those who face barriers to employment through its national employability service, Fair Start Scotland. An article written by Angus Cochrane. The National News on Wednesday the 18th of May. One hunger death every 48 seconds. Amid crisis. An article written by Adam Robertson. Oxfam has said that world leaders are failing to tackle the catastrophic hunger crisis facing millions across Africa amid a cut in the UK aid budget. One person is likely to be dying of hunger every 48 seconds in drought-ravaged Ethiopia, Kenya and Somalia, according to estimates by Oxfam and Save the Children. The statistics were revealed in a report titled Dangerous Delay 2, The Cost of Inaction, produced in partnership with the Jameel Observatory. Oxfam GB's Chief Impact Officer John Plastow said, despite worsening warning signs over time, world leaders have responded woefully, too late and still too little, leaving millions of people facing catastrophic hunger. I recently visited drought-affected areas in Ethiopia and Kenya, where I met herders such as Mustafa in Somali region, who had lost all but one of his cattle and even 4 of his 8 hardy camels. People's health is suffering. Many are starting to uproot themselves. Scarcity of resources is causing conflict between communities within households, and the most vulnerable people are already dying. Climate-induced droughts, coupled with conflicts forcing people to flee their homes, as well as the economic impact of COVID-19, has decimated people's ability to cope. The crisis is unfolding against a backdrop of crippling national debts that have more than tripled in under a decade, from a combined $20.7 billion in 2012 to $65.3 billion in 2020 for Somalia, Ethiopia and Kenya combined. This has meant a reduction in the resources available for public services and social protection. Save the Children's spokesperson for East and Southern Africa, Shako Kijala, said, "We're seeing horrific levels of malnutrition, with 5.7 million children currently acutely malnourished." With the UN warning that more than 350,000 could die in Somalia if we do not act, the clock is ticking. The report warned that the world is once again facing a situation similar to the famine in 2011, which killed more than 260,000 people in Somalia, half of them children under 5. Researchers did find an improved response to the 2017 East Africa drought, when widespread famine was averted, although said that the national and global responses have largely remained too slow and too limited to prevent history repeating itself. UK aid to the region has almost halved in the past year due to the cut in the international aid budget. In 2017, the UK government provided £861 million as part of a global response to help avert the famine, but they've allocated just £219 million to the 3 countries over the last year. An article written by Adam Robertson.
The National, May 19. BBC defends Nicola Sturgeon American trip reporting. Report by Laura Webster. The BBC has claimed that reports of a news blackout surrounding the First Minister's trip to America are completely inaccurate after facing criticism over the last few days. Writing in a letter responding to the National's stories about the lack of coverage of Nicola Sturgeon's Washington DC visit, BBC Scotland's head of news and current affairs, Gary Smith, hit back against the claims. Sturgeon is in the United States, promoting Scotland's links with the country, and has met with United States House of Representatives Speaker Nancy Pelosi, senior State Department figure Wendy Sherman, and several others. As of Wednesday night, 2 days on from these meetings, the BBC News website had not reported the contents of these meetings. However, the site used a photo of Sturgeon with Pelosi to illustrate an analysis piece looking at the First Minister's comments on NATO made in a speech to the Brookings Institution in Washington days prior. It was not clear why the corporation failed to report on Pelosi describing the First Minister as a model to women everywhere for her leadership as they met. Stuart Easton, a former head of news at BBC Radio Scotland, said on Tuesday that coverage of the SNP chief's visit had been noticeably and wrongly absent. In his letter, Smith claimed that the National had misrepresented the facts and argued the broadcaster provided significant coverage. He said, "The First Minister's trip was the lead story on the BBC News website Scotland index page for much of Monday. It led on the warnings from the First Minister on climate change following the COP26 conference in Glasgow. This story carried several paragraphs of quotes from the First Minister and led the site for over 7 hours. Later in the afternoon, following Alok Sharma's comments on the same topic in Scotland, we updated the story to take into account his position." He went on, "We then carried an online feature from political editor Glenn Campbell on the First Minister's comments about NATO, which also included quotes from SNP Defence spokesman Stuart MacDonald MP. Smith added that MacDonald had described the National's coverage as daft. The BBC chief also alleged that the organisation had requested to interview Sturgeon on Monday, but were told this could not be accommodated. He went on, "Far from operating a blackout, as your misleading headline suggests, the BBC has in fact provided significant coverage of the First Minister's visits across all our platforms." Report by Laura Webster. The National, May 19. Former diplomat pins blame on Liz Truss for Turnip's Brexit comments. Report by Craig Meehan. A former British diplomat has claimed that Foreign Secretary Liz Truss was behind comments in 2019 suggesting that the impact of a no-deal Brexit in Ireland would only affect a few farmers with turnips in the back of their trucks. The claim, which has unearthed the comments from 2019, comes as Ms Truss continues to defend UK government plans to legislate to override parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol as necessary to protect the Good Friday Agreement. Alexandra Hall, a former British ambassador to Georgia, who was the lead Brexit envoy for the UK government in Washington for several years, alleged that Ms Truss made the comments as part of a speech to a United States audience in 2019. She tweeted late on Wednesday, "So pleased to see Liz Truss become a genuine expert on Irish matters. She was, after all, the minister who told a United States audience 3 years ago that Brexit would not have any serious impact in Ireland. It would merely affect a few farmers with turnips in the backs of their trucks." Hall had previously claimed to have heard a senior British minister make the comments about a no-deal Brexit, but on Wednesday she attributed the remarks to Truss, who was then Trade Secretary. It is understood that those close to Truss have claimed not to recognise the comments. Hall later quit as a diplomat after more than 3 decades, citing concerns over the UK government's handling of Brexit and being forced to peddle half-truths. Report by Craig Meehan. The National, May 19. Question time. MP who made Scottish slavery joke in Commons joins panel. Report by Laura Webster. A Tory MP who sent her colleagues laughing by making a joke about sending Scots to the colonies as slaves will appear on the BBC's Question Time tonight. The broadcaster's flagship politics show will see Solicitor General Lucy Fraser joined by SNP MP Alan Smith, Labour MP Lucy Powell, the Institute for Economic Affairs Emily Carver, and commentator Mo Hussein. A clip of Fraser joking about enslaved Scots during her 2015 maiden speech in the Commons has gone viral online several times over the years. The MP for South East Cambridgeshire told the Chamber, "Cambridgeshire is the home of Oliver Cromwell, who defeated the Scots at Dunbar, incorporated Scotland into his protectorate, and transported the Scots as slaves to the colonies." Now there is an answer to the West Lothian question, but not one that of course I would recommend. Her Tory colleagues then erupted into laughter. Fraser has since apologised for the comments, saying in the aftermath she had received several furious messages from Scots on her Facebook page. "I am extremely sorry for any offence I have caused," she told the Sunday Herald. "That was not my intention. I have the highest regard for Scotland and the Scottish people." Historian Dr. Tanja Bultmann criticised Fraser's comments at the time, calling them ill-judged. "Slavery has a long history all around the world, and one that sadly still continues in too many places to this day," she wrote in a blog post. "That fact alone, if nothing else, should be sufficient enough to prevent politicians from using a reference to slavery for taking cheap political jibes at the opposite side. Apparently not." A spokesperson for the SNP also called the speech, and its accompanying sneering laughter, pretty distasteful. Report by Laura Webster. The National, May 19. Sarwar accused of dirty deal with Tories. Report by Gregor Young. Anas Sarwar has been accused of unpardonable acts of betrayal over claims his party has done deals with Tory council groups across Scotland. The SNP took aim at Scottish Labour for allegedly plotting several backroom deals to take control of local authority administrations following the May 5 elections. Ahead of the vote, the party's leader had vowed that no Scottish Labour groups would enter formal coalitions with other parties. The SNP had offered to work formally with other progressive parties, as they had done in several parts of Scotland before the elections. The SNP have been angered by reports of Scottish Labour groups on several councils forming or attempting to form minority administrations that can only be achieved with the support of Conservative councillors, while stopping short of formal agreements. Nicola Sturgeon's party has accused Labour of plotting dirty deals with the Tories in North Lanarkshire, South Lanarkshire, Stirling, Moray and Fife. SNP Deputy Leader Keith Brown said, "The people of Scotland have long memories, and they will never forgive the Tories under Margaret Thatcher, who laid waste to this country's economy, for which many are still paying the price." For a Scottish Labour leader to tolerate such a stitch-up with this corrupt, immoral, law-breaking Tory party is an unpardonable act of betrayal of working-class Scots who rejected the Tories at the ballot box just 2 weeks ago. Anas Sarwar has shredded any last remaining integrity he has to lead Labour in Scotland. The Scottish Tories endured dismal results on polling day, dropping to third place overall behind Labour. Multiple scandals at Westminster and Boris Johnson's overwhelming unpopularity were cited as key factors for their poor performance. The party did win control of Murray Council from the SNP after gaining 3 seats. They were able to form a minority administration after Labour's 3 councillors abstained from a leadership vote last week, along with the 2 independents and 1 Green on the council. The SNP, who were ousted from controlling the local authority, accused Labour of helping to usher in a Tory administration. Brown continued, "Scotland has not voted to put the Tories into power for 70 years, but Scottish Labour has just done exactly that. It is a shameful day for the party." Last year, Sarwar stated that while he disagreed on the constitution, he was making a big offer to work with the SNP to make positive progress together. What happened to Sarwar's promise? Was it an honest offer, or was it a line out of the Boris Johnson playbook, where you say whatever you like, then backtrack, as if you had never made such a promise in the first place? The people of Scotland need to know if Anas Sarwar is an honest broker, or is he Boris Johnson in disguise? Scottish Labour have been contacted for comment. In South Lanarkshire, Labour took control of the council thanks to support from the Tories and the Lib Dems, despite the SNP being returned as the largest party. Their 27 seats were not enough to take a majority on the 64-seat council. Backed by the Tories in a crunch leadership vote, Labour formed an administration in partnership with the Lib Dems and an independent councillor. SNP Minister Mary McCallan dubbed it a sad day for democracy. Labour Council leader Joe Fagan said, "This new administration will be a new kind of administration, Labour-led, but not Labour only. The basis of this administration is a partnership agreement between the Labour and Liberal Democrat groups, an agreement to which the leader of the independent group is also a party." According to a leaked memo seen by the Daily Record, any Labour agreements will be signed off by party chiefs. A note in the name of Scottish Labour General Secretary James Kelly, dated May 5, explained there would be flexibility around local agreements post-election. However, it said that Labour groups could not enter into arrangements without the specific approval of the party's Scottish Executive Committee, the SEC, and that an SEC subcommittee would consider every post-election arrangement request. A Scottish Labour spokesperson told the Record, "Scottish Labour has been clear. Labour councillors will engage in no coalitions or pacts with any other parties and seek to form minority administrations." Report by Gregor Young.
And that was this week's The National Podcast, normally recorded in our studio at the Bishopbriggs Media Centre, currently recorded from our volunteers' homes with the publisher's kind permission. Thanks for listening.